November 1963, a tank farm in Bayonne, New Jersey, holds what paperwork says is worth tens of millions of dollars in soybean oil. Inspectors have checked it. Bankers have loaned against it. American Express has certified it, aggressed it. Then someone climbs a ladder, opens a hatch, and lowers a dipstick all the way down. Oil for the first few feet. Below that, something else, 287s, seawater, tank after tank, mostly seawater, with just enough oil floating on top to fool a probe. The company holding these tanks owes over $100 million to banks and brokers across America. In 3 days, a different story will bury this one completely. This is Dead Man's Ledger. Anthony De Angelis was born in 1915 in the Bronx, the son of Italian immigrants. He never finished high school. He didn't need to. He had a gift for something rarer than education. He understood, instinctively, how markets worked when nobody was watching too closely. He came up in the meatpacking business in the 1930s and 40s. Learning the trade from the inside, how shipments were weighed, graded, invoiced, and paid for. It was a business built on trust and paperwork. Where the physical product and the document describing it were supposed to match. De Angelis learned early that they didn't always have to. By 1955, De Angelis had already been convicted once for fraud involving short chains meat shipments to government school lunch programs. It should have ended his career. Instead, within a few years he had reinvented himself entirely. He moved into vegetable oil, and in Bayonne, New Jersey, he founded the Allied Crude Vegetable Oil Refining Corporation. Soybean and cottonseed oil were booming commodities in post-war America, tied to government export subsidies designed to help farmers move surplus crops overseas. De Angelis positioned Allied right at the center of that system, buying, storing and trading oil on a scale few competitors could match. Vegetable oil trading in that era ran on a simple mechanism: warehouse receipts. A company storing oil in tanks would have its inventory certified by an independent inspector. That certified receipt, a piece of paper, became collateral. Banks lent against it. Brokers traded futures against it. Nobody needed to physically recheck the tanks each time the paper changed hands. The certification was the guarantee, and the company certifying Allied's tanks wasn't some obscure local inspector. It was American Express Field Warehousing Corporation, a subsidiary of one of the most trusted names in American finance. If Amex said the oil was there, why would anyone doubt it? Here is where the fraud actually lived. Not in some hidden ledger, but inside the tanks themselves. Each storage tank at Bayonne was enormous, dozens of feet tall, holding what was supposed to be pure vegetable oil. De Angelis's crews rigged them. Some tanks were filled almost entirely with seawater, pumped in from the harbor, with only a thin floating layer of real oil on top. Just enough for an inspector's dipstick to come up coated. Other tanks were connected by hidden pipes, so oil could be pumped from tank to tank just ahead of an inspection, making a handful of tanks look like dozens were full. The inspectors were checking real oil. They just weren't checking nearly enough of it, partaking May 0. With certified receipts in hand, De Angelis didn't just borrow against them once. He borrowed against them again and again, pledging the same barrels of oil, real and imaginary, to multiple lenders and brokers simultaneously. He used the borrowed money to take enormous speculative positions in soybean oil futures, betting that prices would keep rising. For a while, they did. Allied Crude Vegetable Oil grew into what looked like a titan of the industry, controlling a share of the American vegetable oil trade so large that some estimates placed it above the country's entire reported inventory. The numbers didn't make sense. Almost nobody asked why. The scheme depended on layers of institutional trust, each one vouching for the next. Banks trusted the warehouse receipts because American Express's name was on them. American Express trusted its own field inspectors because the process had worked for years. Government subsidy programs kept rewarding large, volume traders, which meant the bigger De Angelis's positions grew, the more legitimate he appeared. Nobody in this chain was checking the physical tanks against the paper anymore. They were checking the paper against other paper. Dials. It was trust, stacked on seawater. By 1963, De Angelis's bet on rising soybean oil prices had grown enormous, so large that his own trading activity was distorting the market he was betting on. Then the position began to unravel. Prices didn't move the way he needed. To cover mounting losses, he needed the tanks to be worth even more than they already falsely claimed. The lie couldn't grow forever. Somewhere in the shipping office or a bank's back room, someone finally did the arithmetic that should have been done years earlier. And the numbers came up impossible. On November 19, 1963, Allied Crude Vegetable Oil Refining Corporation filed for bankruptcy. Word spread through the commodity markets fast. Soybean oil futures collapsed. Banks and brokerage houses that had lent tens of millions of dollars against Allied's warehouse receipts suddenly held paper backed by nothing but harbor water. Some smaller brokerage firms that had overextended themselves on Allied's positions were wiped out entirely, unable to cover their own obligations. It was, by the estimates of the time, a fraud on the order of $150 million. Built, in the end, on a few inches of oil floating over seawater in a stretch of tanks in Bayonne, New Jersey. 3 days later, on November 22, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The nation's attention, and its front pages, turned entirely elsewhere. Nest egg. A financial scandal that would otherwise have dominated headlines for weeks was pushed to the margins of newspapers already consumed by grief and shock. It is a strange, almost accidental mercy of history that one of the era's largest frauds unfolded in the shadow of a national tragedy. The victims of the swindle, the banks, the brokers, the smaller investors who lost savings tied up in commodity firms, two ends, absorbed their losses largely out of the public eye. American Express absorbed the heaviest blow, zero. Its stock price fell by roughly half in the weeks after the scandal broke, as investors weighed just how much the field warehousing subsidiary's failure might cost the parent company. Amex ultimately paid out tens of millions of dollars in claims, reported at somewhere around $60 million, to settle its exposure. The company did not collapse. Its core business, the charge cards and traveler's checks that had nothing to do with warehouse receipts, remained sound. But for a moment, on paper, American Express looked like it might be the next domino to fall. That falling stock price caught the attention of a young investor named Warren Buffett. He believed the market was punishing American Express for a subsidiary's failure, while ignoring that its real business, trust in a name, 62 Real Biz, carried in millions of wallets, was untouched. He invested heavily while the stock was down, at a price others considered too risky to touch. It became one of the defining early bets of his career, and one of the clearest lessons in value investing, that a company's worst headline is not always the same as its actual worth. The same scandal that nearly broke American Express helped build a legend. De Angelis himself was arrested and, in 1965, convicted on federal charges of fraud and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He served a portion of that sentence before parole, and by the 1970s he was free again, and, before long, entangled in new fraud allegations. As though the pattern was simply who he was. He died in 1996, largely out of public memory. The man whose name once sat behind one of the largest commodity frauds in American history. The tanks in Bayonne were eventually drained, measured, and found to hold only a small fraction of what their paperwork had always claimed. The ledger, then, roughly $150 million in fraud, spread across banks and brokers who trusted paper more than tanks. American Express alone absorbed around $60 million in claims, and its stock fell by half before recovering. Several brokerage firms tied to Allied's positions were destroyed outright. 20 years was the sentence handed to the man behind it all. He served only a portion before returning to the world, and to more schemes, before his death in 1990, and in a final irony that history seemed to write on purpose. This scandal, one of the largest financial frauds of its era, was pushed off the front page within 72 hours by the assassination of a president. The lie was built on a few feet of oil floating over a tank of seawater. It fooled dipsticks, inspectors, bankers, and one of the most trusted names in American finance. The ledger never balances. Subscribe. Next week, the ledger opens again.